Order. Hearing is now resumed.
Mr. Commissioner Brock Martland, appearing as Associate Commission Counsel with respect to today's hearing, and with me today are Kathy Grant and Jennifer Hill. Today's evidence is a single day focusing on forestry and logging practices and management, and focusing, of course, on Fraser River sockeye habitat where we can. We have a panel of 3 witnesses today. They'll be affirmed in a moment. I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to cover a few points at the outset. Dr. Peter Czaplinski and Ian Miller from the province, as well as Peter Delaney from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, are all present to testify today. We had planned to have a 4th witness, Dr. Gordon Hartman, testify on this panel. He asked to withdraw last week. In the circumstances, we acceded to his request. Obviously, he's not here on the panel. We'll continue with these panelists. At the outset, I should ask to have the policy and practice report, and I'll be referring through the day to what I'll refer to as our list of exhibits, but that's a list that we've circulated out to participants listing documents we may be leading today. Number 5 on that list is the PPR entitled Regulation of Forestry Activities Impacting Fraser River Sockeye Habitat, 20th of May 2011. If I could ask that please be marked as a PPR in these proceedings.
It'll be marked as PPR number 17.
As we move into panel, questions of the panel, I will ask other council where they're able to direct questions to a particular panel member rather than the panel as a whole, if that's possible to do so. I have time allocations for the from participants. I'm grateful that participants have been very cooperative in compressing and agreeing to me to some extent compressing their time so that we can complete. And our plan for the day is to not take a lunch break, to run from 9 till 1 o'clock. I expected around 11 a.m. we would move to about a 20-minute break. Mr. Prowse had asked if he, and I'll see if he still wishes to do this, he wished to perhaps use 5 minutes for a break after my questions, on the understanding that would run into his time. And I've said if he wishes to do that, I don't see a difficulty. We'll ask him at the end of my questions. So I'll ask first that these panel members be affirmed, and then Mr. Lunn, I'll be moving through numbers 1, 2, and 3, the respective CVs for these witnesses.
Solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you through this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I affirm.
I affirm.
I affirm.
Just state your name, please.
My name is Peter Czaplinski.
Good morning. My name is Ian Miller.
Peter Delaney.
Thank you. Council.
Dr. Czaplinski, I'll begin with you, and I'll have number 1 on the screen, and I'll just ask, I hope, an easy question. Right now you see some fish, but in a moment I think you'll see your CV. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
I'll ask that please be marked as the first exhibit today.
That'll be marked as exhibit 1104.
In brief form, Mr. Dr. Czaplinski, I understand that you began work as a research scientist for the DFO in 1983, working on the coho salmon program, that you obtained your PhD in marine ecology from the University of Victoria in 1987, and worked as a contract research scientist for DFO until 1992, and at that point took a position as research scientist fish habitat biology for the fish forestry interactions and watershed research program with the ecology and earth sciences section of the research branch of the BC Ministry of Forests.
That is correct, sir.
In 2000, you became the acting manager of the research program and assumed that substantive position in 2003. And in turn, in 2010, you moved to the Ministry of Environment as a research scientist with the Aquatic Ecosystems Conservation Science Program. In that position, you continue your work on fish forestry interactions?
That is correct, sir.
I understand that in the course of some 25 years of research on fish forestry interactions, you've been involved in a number of multi-agency fish forestry projects, including the Carnation Creek Fish Forestry Interaction Project, the Queen Charlotte Islands Fish Forestry Interaction Program, the Stuart Takla Fisheries Forestry Interaction Project. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
And you currently lead the province's, what I'll be referring to as FREP, the Forest and Range Evaluation Program?
To correct that statement, sir, I lead a component of it, not the entire program. I am what they call the resource value team lead for the fish value, and essentially that is the fish value as affected by riparian management.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, I'll have number 2 please brought up on screen, and when we see that, I'll ask whether you recognize that as your CV.
Yes, I do.
I'll ask this please be marked as the next exhibit, Mr. Registrar.
The exhibit 1105.
Mr. Miller, you have a BSc in forestry from the University of British Columbia from 1984. You've been a registered professional forester since 1986, and in the period of 1974 to 1986, you worked in various forestry-related jobs, including a silviculture field technician, timber cruiser, logger, and mill worker, and I understand that you joined the BC Forest Service in 1985 and have remained there through a number of ministry name changes over a period. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Your initial work for the Forest Service was in resource management and timber supply. In the mid-1990s, you became the senior harvest practices forester, working out of Victoria and supervising operational planning under what we'll be referring to as the PPR does as the code, the Forest Practices Code. Is that correct?
Substantially, the use of the term supervision of operational planning might lead you to believe I had more hands-on, direct guidance and leadership of the delivery of operational planning. I was a policy forester in the area of legislation and policy around operational planning. So supervising operational planning per se, I think, is perhaps overstating the case.
Thank you for clarifying that. In 2001, you moved to the position, indeed, of legislation and policy forester, where your work focused on the transition to what's been referred to as a results-based legislation and the development of FERPA, FRPA, the Forest and Range Practices Act.
Correct.
And in since 2006, you've served as the manager of the Sustainable Forest Management section, and you've worked on setting up joint technical committees, including between the province and DFO.
I think it would be an overstatement to say I've set up those teams. The teams were in existence prior to my engagement in all instances.
You currently serve on the Fish Passage Technical Working Group?
Yes, and I chair that group.
Mr. Delaney, number 3 on our list, I hope will be your CV. When that appears, I'll ask if you recognize that as being your CV. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
If that might be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 1106.
Mr. Delaney, you have a bachelor's degree from 1972 in zoology and a master's degree in 1979 in zoology, specifically fisheries, both from UBC. You began work as a fisheries biologist with BC Hydro Limited in 1978, then worked as a consultant until joining the Habitat Division of DFO in 1981. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
You have held several positions with the Habitat Division, which is now OHEB, Oceans Habitat and Enhancement Branch. And your work with the department has included, over time, developing and implementing habitat guidelines, monitoring and enforcement initiatives related to land and water uses, representing the department in projects such as the implementation of the province's code, Forest Practices Code, in the mid-1990s. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
From 1997 to 2005, you held the position of Chief Habitat Policy Unit and Fish Habitat Unit, and in that position you were responsible for delivering regional coordination of policy and procedure related to forestry, including being DFO's representative on joint committees developed under FERPA. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
You then worked as a senior program advisor in the period of 2005 to 2007, and among other things, coordinated the interaction of provincial agencies, industry, and regional DFO habitat staff in relation to fish forestry files. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And since 2007, you've worn a different hat, so to speak, and have worked as an Aboriginal consultation advisor with OHEB?
Yes.
Thank you. Those were very long and elaborate questions, but it allowed me to cover that important background at some speed. I'll start with, if you will, the broadest of questions, and Dr. Czaplinski, I'll ask this of you. In general, I'll try to direct my questions, but invite other panel members to add additional comments if they have them, and let me know if you do. Dr. Czaplinski, Could you please identify what you see as the main forestry-related impacts on Fraser River sockeye habitat?
There are a number of potential impacts, and those impacts could be around changes to watershed hydrology based on amount of forest harvested, the rate of harvest. The hydrology changes could influence stream flow, stream processes, channel form, erosional processes, and that translates to certain elements of fish habitat. Other ways forestry potentially could affect streams and fish, or aquatic environments and fish, is through streamside management practices, and how the streamside environment might change with different practices applied, and there could be impacts on a number of different levels. Water temperature, nutrient provision to the streams, provision of wood floor, channel structure, bank and stream microclimate, subforest microclimate, and so forth. Those are some of the main issues.
And if we move through some of these types of impacts, I'd ask for your comments in as much as you're able to give them on the nature and the level of the impact arising. I'll begin first with sedimentation.
Sedimentation, the topic of sediment in itself is neither good nor bad. It's an entity, and without sediment in streams, for example, there would be no fish habitat as we recognize it. The big issue is the rate of sediment input and the rate of sediment removal by the stream current. In undisturbed situations, in environments undisturbed by human activity, what is moved downstream by the work of the current stream discharge is replaced from sources from upslope and from the banks. The issue around forestry is whether those processes are altered so that acceleration of sediment delivery to the channel is an issue. Also, if there are debris torrents that move down the channel through any mechanism such as landslide input of material, mass movement of sediment out of the channel could occur. Sediment can affect fish through a number of mechanisms. Sediment in excess could fill pool habitat, for example, fill other kinds of stream bed features in the channel, such as the shallow riffles, filling in the spaces between the larger gravels and cobbles. These are often hiding spaces for certain species of fish. Sediment can affect benthic invertebrate production, food organisms for fish. They're important. Excess sediment is known to decrease their abundance. Sediment can also directly affect the survival of fish, egg survival, juvenile habitat in the stream, and those primarily are the things we're concerned about.
And what sorts of logging or forestry practices lead to those sorts of concerns or issues you've just described?
Practices on steep, unstable terrain have been known to cause landslides that may enter channels directly connected to the channel network. Streamside practices that remove vegetation to the point where they could alter the proper functioning of the channel through any of those things that I've mentioned, altering shade, altering water temperature, altering nutrient, organic material input to the channel, changing the dynamics of the channel, changing erosional processes, sediment storage and release. Streamside practices, harvesting trees directly from the stream bank in particular, can affect some of those processes.
Let me move next to ask about stream bank stabilization, please.
Stream banks in streams that are unaffected by human development, undisturbed channels, are able to withstand peak flood events without radically changing their form, without experiencing radical rates of erosion, sediment release to the channel. The stability issue is really a dynamic one. Stream banks are not static. They change naturally over time at a natural rate. The issue for stability, again, under forest practices, is not to accelerate rates of change so that the channel becomes destabilized to the extent where impacts to the stream and aquatic habitats occur, such as bank collapse due to excessive rates of erosion, disruption of stable in-stream large woody debris. That debris is partly in place because of channels that are relatively stable. When the channel banks go, the debris goes. When the debris goes, the stream becomes a more simpler environment. The alternating sequence in many low gradient streams, important for salmon, deep pools, slow moving water, faster riffle areas in between them. These features, which add diversity for the channel and fish habitat, tend to become lost. The diversity declines, the habitat quality decreases, and the capacity of the stream to support fish decreases. So the stable banks are important for maintaining those structures, characteristics, and functions.
Water flow and temperature.
Water flow can be altered in a number of ways, the most important of which would be in the amount, the extent of watershed area harvested. That factor alone can serve to, in some cases, increase the levels of runoff because, number one, the full forest isn't available to transpire. Some of the precipitation that falls to the ground is taken up by the trees. Runoff is increased because the foliage, the amount of foliage of the forest isn't present to intercept precipitation. So what happens in this case is that water yields, as they say, from a drainage basin, from a watershed, can increase over time. It's usually measured on an annual basis. Also, because of the fact that some of the forest is being removed, flow timing can alter. Runoff is faster. Peak flows can be reached quicker after storm events. And those peak flows may be in some cases associated with higher rates of channel alteration and consequently fish habitat impact.
I have two other...
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer your water temperature question. The water temperature question is largely a matter of riparian vegetation removal, increasing the amount of sun that falls on the channel, directly heating the water.
And that refers to not having shade effectively right at the stream level?
That is correct.
Topics to cover. One is fish passage obstructions.
Fish habitat passage obstructions can be through both natural disturbances, or they can be also the consequence of improperly installed crossing structures in streams. Those are road crossings of streams. In particular, crossings that are built with round metal pipes or culverts, particularly an issue on fish-bearing streams. Culverts can become blocked if not cleaned and maintained regularly. Culverts, if installed into the stream channel incorrectly, can be problematic. Some issues around their installation include culverts that are too long. For example, culverts in excess of 30 meters. Culverts that do not have any semblance of natural stream bed materials in them to reduce water velocities and allow fish to pass. Culverts that are installed at the incorrect slope in the crossing, a slope that does not match the gradient of the channel. Those situations can result in the outlet of the culvert, the downstream end of the culvert, being perched. And generally speaking, if culverts are perched 30 centimeters or more, they are a serious issue for fish passage in both directions.
I have a question about the mountain pine beetle, and that's a phenomenon that is, I think, well reported and people have some under at least awareness of. And I understand that the province has permitted salvage logging arising from the spread of the mountain pine beetle. Could you comment on the effect of mountain pine beetle and in particular salvage logging arising because of that, tying that back to habitat for Fraser River sockeye?
The mountain pine beetle epidemic is, of course, enormous and unprecedented in British Columbia. I believe the latest estimates are that 17.5 million hectares has been affected to one extent or another. This is an area approximately 5 times the size of Vancouver Island, so it is substantial. And the great majority of the area that is so affected is within the Fraser River drainage. So potentially there could be issues concerning sockeye salmon habitat, spawning, rearing, and migration habitats. Now we are aware that the mountain pine beetle epidemic itself and large-scale salvage harvesting in addition can have a number of effects, some of which I've already alluded to. High rates of salvage harvest could mean high equivalent clear-cut areas in a watershed, and high levels of forest removal could mean increased water table levels because of alteration to watershed hydrology, less interception of precipitation, faster runoff in the interior. This could mean faster and earlier snowmelt in the spring, also contributing to high levels and rapid runoff. And these could have high energy erosional implications for both spawning and rearing habitats. The mountain pine beetle epidemic, I believe, peaked approximately in 2005. It still is ongoing, and we have been in the field looking at some of the potential effects or actual effects of that. And perhaps I'll speak in more detail about the Forest and Range Evaluation Program assessments later on in these proceedings. Suffice it to say that to this point, our information from the field in field seasons 2005 through to 2008 indicate that a substantial number or proportion of the impacts we have seen can be attributed to the infestation alone and the infestation augmented by fires that can be more frequent and more severe as one of the consequences of the mountain pine beetle infestation. Dead, drying forests, dead foliage. There's the potential that fires started by any mechanism can occur. They can be more frequent, and the consequences for stream channels may be increased water temperatures, changes in the dynamics of material delivery. There could be issues of terrain stability and landslide frequency increase. Our assessments in the field show that this hasn't occurred to date. For the most part, licensees who have been salvaging wood have maintained riparian management areas as per Forest Practice Code or FERPA standard. One of the reasons may be that in most riparian areas, pine is not a leading species. Spruce is, and other species. So the opportunities for salvage are more complicated. For the most part, we see that riparian areas have not been clear-cut any more than they normally are through normal practices.
And I wonder if I can pick up on that question of the practices of industry, so to speak, but also you mentioned FREP, and to tie this really together in a sense, I think, I wonder whether we could move to numbers 8 and 9, and Mr. Lunn, if you're able to bring those two up alongside each other, just at least the first page of each of those documents, that would be helpful. And the question at a general level being, and certainly welcoming you to move to discussion of FREP, although I'll ask for the 2-minute overview rather than a more detailed explanation of it. But via FREP, or more generally, if you could comment on forest practices and impacts in our understanding and your understanding of the impacts of those practices, and in particular the insights through the report on the right, which is number 9 on the list, the State of Stream Channels, Fish Habitats and Their Adjacent Riparian Areas report.
report that you see, number 27, the FREP report, is the outcome of, to this point, field assessments of the post-harvest condition of streams in the riparian areas throughout British Columbia. The report is based on assessments in the field that were implemented by using a comprehensive suite of indicators in a methodology that was developed by a multi-agency federal provincial academia team in 2004, 2003, 2004. That methodology and protocol was piloted in that same year, 2004, made operational in 2005. We've done annual surveys ever since. This report speaks to a sample of 1,441 streams that were assessed for post-harvest conditions. And they were assessed on the principle of what we call properly functioning condition. Every stream can be in one of four states after harvesting. 3 of those are proper functioning, from the best possible state to 2 other states which also, although properly functioning, there are some alterations that have accumulated, not enough to kick the site and the stream into a not properly functioning condition. And our outcomes, very generally, if I can put the 4 different possibilities into common language, the properly functioning states would be excellent, very good, and good. The not properly functioning would be poor. 87% of streams in the province were in one of those 3 states of properly functioning condition. About 40% in the best condition. Another, the remainder, up to 87%, would be in the 2 intermediate categories. 13% of streams in the province are not properly functioning, and most of those are the very small headwater, non-fish-bearing tributaries at the highest elevations in watersheds where much of the harvesting is occurring today. About one out of 5 of those channels are not properly functioning, and also about 1 out of 10 of the smallest fish-bearing tributaries are not properly functioning. But
what I should, before I forget to do this, report
Yes.
number 27, which you've just referred to, I think we should mark that as an exhibit. And of course, we can only cover this in an overview way, but the document gives us in quite some detail this classification and the results of that work. And indeed, did you write that report?
I wrote the report.
Number 27 might be marked, I'm sorry, number 9 on the exhibit list, report number 27, if that might be marked as the next exhibit.
This is Exhibit 1107.
The document on the left is the Chief Forester's 2010 annual report on the Forest and Range Evaluation Program, which is a more general description. The date on that is February 2011 of the work under FREP. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
If that might be marked as the next exhibit, please. To what extent does the FREP report that you were involved in writing give us insights as to work under FERPA as opposed to the code, or is this more of a picture that's painted of what was going on under the code than under FERPA?
It is much more a picture of what was occurring under the Forest Practices Code of British Columbia. Streams, riparian areas, and watersheds managed under the FERPA are being assessed as we speak. What was really important, however, is to get a baseline of performance under the Forest Practices Code. The riparian management standards and practices under the code have been largely migrated to the FERPA. Licensees can also do something alternate to these standards, if so approved in a forest stewardship plan. But by and large, the stream classification system, the system of riparian management areas, no harvest reserves and management zones remain the same. And to look at whether or not the FERPA is getting us better results, worse results, or the same results, we needed to look at streams managed under the code to see if those standards and practices that collectively were considered to be acceptable, were they really giving us the expected results on the ground? Protection of streams and fish habitat that had never been done in a systematic way, at least province-wide. And that's where report number 27 comes in. And we have found that there are by and large, good practices, but we've also identified some outcomes that are not so good, and there are a number of intermediate outcomes. What we have found is ways of making those outcomes better. So part of the FREP is to look at what is going right, what is not going right, and how to make areas that need improvement, how to make good on those. The Chief Forester's report contains recommendations for the latter, how to improve results more broadly. And so there are a number of recommendations for improved results in that report in the riparian fish section. And we have seen that our findings show that when these small streams have no harvest buffers 10 meters wide or wider, they invariably have very good outcomes. So we have recommended a minimum of 10 meters no harvest buffer around small fish-bearing streams and all perennially flowing non-fish-bearing tributaries to them. And those are perennial streams that can provide important materials for the fish habitat downslope. That's water, sediments needed for habitat, invertebrates for fish food, organic nutrients, and in some cases, larger organic materials important for channel structure. All of those streams that provide these things, we are recommending that these reserves be implemented. And for the non-perennially flowing tributaries, those that can still provide important materials for fish habitats, such as the water and the nutrients when they do flow, we are recommending as many canopy trees as possible be retained, but all of the understory and non-merchantable vegetation. For all other streams, those that are not directly connected to fish habitat, and streams that are flowing perhaps just ephemerally, we suggest that the riparian area remain intact by preserving all of the understory and non-merchantable trees in those sites. We have found in FREP that a lot more retention occurs along streams than anyone ever imagined. And it's just one of those consequences about going outside and seeing what's really going on. And FREP is the
better
first.
Than your expectations?
Well, yes, and my personal expectations as well. The anecdotal information was that these small streams almost invariably were clear-cut to the stream banks. We found this not to be the case. In fact, 80% of the small tributary S4 fish-bearing streams received no harvest buffers. And those buffers on average were 17 meters wide. And the buffers of those streams that averaged 24 meters wide were actually in virtually pristine condition. And those were implemented in places across the province. No one ever expected the outcomes for the small fish-bearing tributaries, the class S6s. Almost invariably, it was commonly thought that these channels would be clear-cut. 56% of them received no harvest buffers, and those buffers on average were 11 meters wide. And the variance around these averages was quite small. 1 meter for the S6s, less than 2 meters for the S4s. So these practices were applied at least consistently enough to have pretty tight variation around these means. Now there are those streams that didn't get this kind of treatment, 44% of S6s, and about 20% of S4s. All kinds of different sorts of retention would occur in these sites. Not all of them would be clear-cut, but invariably, where clear-cutting did occur, that's where we found the bulk of our problems. Hence, the Chief Forester's recommendations for improvement.
I'm mindful of the fact I haven't let your colleagues, or at least I haven't put questions to them yet, so they may be wondering why they're on the panel. I'll ask indeed Mr. Miller. They may be happy, but I'm sorry to change that. Mr. Miller,
I'm not
going to have
sorry.
Mr. Lund bring up number 7 on the list of exhibits, please. This, I hope, is an easy, quick question, but you can see if that's the case. This is the State of BC's Forests 2010 report. Is that correct? I'll ask that be marked as the next exhibit, please. In brief, is it correct that this is, or at least if I might confirm, this report is issued, if not annually, periodically, prepared by the province in order to describe the state of the forest to, in a sense, report on industry and report on what's happening.
That's correct, and it is a periodic, not an annual publication.
Thank you.
Tab 9 will be marked as 1109.
Mr. Miller and Mr. Delaney both, and I'll preface this by saying, although it may be artificial for people who are sitting in the courtroom watching these proceedings, we have a fairly detailed policy and practice report. Later in my questions, I'll direct you to some of the points that all of you as panelists have identified with respect to that report and some clarifications or corrections. At this point, if we might take that as a shared understanding, or as something that we've all looked at, with that as some context, what I'd like to focus in on is the current work that the province and DFO are doing on fish forestry interactions. In particular, Mr. Miller, I'll start with you. If you could give us a picture of I appreciate the provincial ministries change names, and I don't know to what extent the responsibilities change, but if there's a present day snapshot, who's doing what?
Thank you, and I will try and keep this brief. There's many aspects of this answer and lots of detail I could get into. I'll try and limit my comments to the places I'm aware of and actively engaged in that do intersect between the province and the federal government around fisheries and fish habitat management. First of all, and we've already mentioned both the Forest Practices Code and the Forest and Range Practices Act and the various regulations and guidebooks that we haven't. I don't know if we've mentioned the guidebooks per se, but the guidebooks that accompany them, all of which have been created in a spirit of collaboration and consultation between the provincial and federal government. Under the large heading of monitoring and enforcement, DFO collaborates with the province on, as Dr. Czaplinski said, the Forest and Range Evaluation Program and many of the scientific criteria that go into our monitoring program of fish, water, and fish habitat. Compliance and enforcement, so we have a large compliance and enforcement staff in our ministry, and they do collaborate and do cooperate on investigations and enforcement work with the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We work together as a province with our federal colleagues on a joint management committee and joint steering committee. These are two of the implementation committees that were started under the Forest Practices Code, continue under FERPA. They are, from a provincial perspective, a collaboration of the resource agencies that are involved in the implementation of those two pieces of legislation, one after the other, the implementation of those two pieces of legislation. We collaborate with DFO at a more local level on perhaps a more ad hoc basis, but we do have a provincial FERPA implementation team, and there was provincial implementation teams for the code. There are regional teams, there are interagency management committees that operate within the operations arm of our ministry that I expect include DFO representatives. I wouldn't say necessarily uniformly everywhere, but I know those committees do engage our DFO colleagues at least sometimes and on those issues that are most relevant. Other pieces I have been engaged with over the years, early in my professional forestry career, worked on, took training and implementing the Fish Forestry Interaction Program that predated the Forest Practices Code. We've collaborated with DFO on the creation of various Forest Practices Code guidebooks and fish stream identification, fish stream crossing guidebook, watershed evaluation, riparian area management guidebooks, notable among them. We work with DFO on the Fish Passage Technical Working Group you mentioned earlier that I chair. We have a DFO representative on that group and have since the beginning. Not my particular area of practice, more Dr. Czaplinski's, but we do collaborate with DFO on a number of research-related activities relative to fish and fish habitat.
Thank you, and I will come back to ask about the guidebooks that you've just described, and indeed I'll have some of those brought up on screen shortly. First, though, Mr. Delaney, if you could please give us a description of the DFO's present involvement on these matters.
Okay, well, as outlined in when you went through my resume, I haven't been actively involved in this file for the last 4 or 5 years. So I was very involved up to that time, and we did have a very active engagement with the the province. As Ian had mentioned, at the corporate level on the Joint Management Committee and Joint Steering Committee, we actively participated there. We were very involved with the province also in the development of FERPA, and also in the development of the code and the subsequent guidebooks that were part of the code implementation. We were also very involved from a research perspective. Our research program was working cooperatively with the province. My understanding more recently, though, given how FERPA operates, that our field engagement, I should add, sorry, just one other piece of clarification. Similar to the province, we have our headquarters staff are in Vancouver, of course the province Victoria, but we also have field staff throughout the region who are the active day-to-day on eyes and ears in the field, looking at referrals and development activities and enforcement activities. So many of these initiatives I was mentioning a few minutes ago, where the federal government has been involved with the province, have been more at the corporate level. At the field level, our staff were engaged in referral reviews, stream crossings, cut block plans, so on and so forth. More recently, though, with FERPA, due to a number of reasons, that our field staff have been less so engaged in reviewing forestry activities. And corporately, it's my understanding that we haven't been as engaged over the last 3 or 4, possibly 5 years with the province, although we do have representation on, as Ian mentioned, the Joint Management and Steering Committees. Our engagement hasn't been as proactive, nor have we been as involved on the research side and the monitoring side. I think the Commission has been informed about the habitat monitoring, the Federal Habitat Monitoring Program, and likely is aware that there are initiatives that are being undertaken now to increase that, the monitoring, and ideally working with the province in those areas there.
You described that there's a number of reasons for the federal government, or at least DFO, not being involved the same way as before. Could you help us understand that? Does that tie to things like on the provincial level FERPA and on the federal level the EPMP, the Environmental Process Modernization Plan?
Yes, there's a number of reasons, and FERPA operates differently than it's results-based, professional reliance, and there is much more reliance upon the industry to undertake their role out there in forest harvesting. So there's not as much information coming to DFO to review referrals as there was in the past. The environmental process modernization that, again, I think has been presented to the Commission is one of streamlining our regulatory reviews, risk management, more partnerships, engaging others in the activities that we're undertaking. So both of these, the implementation of FERPA and likewise the implementation of EPMP, were coming along at the same time. There have been a reduction in staff also during that time period, and an increased number of other development activities occurring. So a number of initiatives coming together out there that have changed the dynamics and how our field staff are doing work.
You say you haven't been in the position of doing this work actively, and you can correct me, is it since 2007, is that?
Yes.
To your knowledge, has someone notionally worn the hat that you used to wear, or is that hat sitting on a...
Well, that's another issue. Thanks for reminding me that corporately in Vancouver, there was a strong role being played to coordinate the federal-provincial interaction, and we also had, I had some staff working on the more technical nature of things, on some of the field studies and developing guidebooks. That position we lost back in the early 2000s, and by the mid-2005-06, I would say the priority placed on our corporate role and the fish forestry file was being reduced. And since I left the position, there have been 1 or 2 people have stepped in and been participating on the Joint Management Committee, some of the calls, but we haven't had the degree of priority placed on that file.
Is there one person who is the point person or the lead on these matters, to your knowledge?
Not, well, I suspect it's the regional manager of the Habitat Protection Unit, Habitat Protection Sustainable Development Unit, but it's one of many tasks that person has, and so it's not a focused effort that it has been in the past.
FERPA, the results-based approach, has that changed the extent to which DFO receives referrals, whether from the province or industry? And I suppose the more pertinent question, does DFO get referrals? It's changed significantly that we're not getting referrals on the, as far as the cutting plans, et cetera, out in the field itself. Stream crossings is another area that was mentioned earlier, and in the stream crossing guidebook, it does note that the notifications are to be sent to Fisheries and Oceans, but in many cases our field staff are not receiving those either. Mr. Miller, I have some documents I'd like to introduce at highway speed, and I'll have Mr. Lunn starting with number 11, and we'll move through sequentially to number 16. But I'll preface this by saying that there were several guidebooks. You can correct me if I have this right or wrong. There were several guidebooks that were developed under the code. At a general level, they were not legally binding, although I understand that some of them were considered to be cited guidebooks, that they had some legal effect, so perhaps you can first of all just clarify that. Were there some of these that were cited and had a legal effect under the code but not now under FERPA?
That is correct. There and the list and number of cited guidebooks I do not have with me. There were a handful.
Okay.
I know as part of this proceedings we've captured 4 guidebooks that are most pertinent to the business area we're discussing here. Of those 4, 2 were cited guidebooks, 2 were not.
Okay. And why don't I move through these, and as we go, if you can, I'll ask the question to introduce the document, but if it's a cited report, that would, or rather cited guidebook, that would be helpful. Number 11, you'll see from 1995, the Riparian Management Area Guidebook.
Yes.
If that might be marked as the next exhibit, please.
1,110.
Number 12 on the list of documents, it's a bit hard to see with the white font, the Fish Stream Crossing Guidebook. Trying to find a date, but in any event...
I think that was a 2002 publication.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. If that might be marked as the next exhibit, please.
1,111.
Number 13 on the list, I think this may be a cited guidebook, but you can tell me if that's right. The Coastal Watershed and Interior Watershed Assessment Procedure Guidebook.
Yes, this was a cited guidebook, and just for everybody's knowledge, I mean, cited means cited in regulation, and therefore at least certain elements of the content of the guidebook would then carry the weight of regulation.
And what we're referring to now as this being a cited guidebook was true under the code, but is not true under the FERPA?
That is absolutely correct.
Thank you. These still nonetheless continue to have relevance and to give important guidance?
They continue to provide useful guidance for resource practitioners and professionals in the province, yes.
I'll move to number 14 and preface it by saying this, I'm sorry, if that might be marked as the next.
Yes, number 13 is 1,112.
Thank you. Number 14 on the list of documents, what we have here is a link which we don't have on screen, but if you can trust us that will take us to, indeed we're about to browse the web together, but we will ensure that our record reflects the proper document, the Coastal Watershed Assessment Procedure Guidebook. Now, I'll preface this by saying, Mr. Commissioner, this is a little bit like a judge who prefers to reach to the first edition of Dreger's book on statutes rather than the more recent updates. It's a bit of a purist version. Dr. Czaplinski, I understand from discussing with you that this 1995 Coastal Watershed Assessment Procedure Guidebook, from a purist point of view, is considered indeed to offer more and in some respects more helpful guidance.
It does in a certain sense, sir. What the main differences are between the first editions of both the coastal and the interior watershed assessment procedures and the subsequent one is that the early procedures contained some quantifiable targets, for example, that practitioners should be able to identify vis-a-vis potential watershed scale issues around disturbances and potential issues for hydrology and the stream channel network. These thresholds were developed on the basis of professional opinion largely. And between the two editions of the guidebook, from the 1995 one to the one at the, I believe it was 1998, the ones that came out in 1998, a large base of information was coming out of the research community that would inform decision-making on thresholds, for example, equivalent clear-cut area, road density on unstable slopes, road density in areas of erodible soil, road density in general, rate of cut, and other factors. New information was coming forth. So there is some question about the veracity of the original thresholds. However, I do understand from some practitioners out there, including government agencies, looking to develop indicators over broad spatial scales, is that the usefulness of some of these thresholds they're still there. They're still useful.
That's helpful.
Yeah, so the second guidebook, I think, went more in the direction of what really happened overall in forestry management, from a more prescriptive basis to a more open one, where professional alliance played a bigger role in obtaining all the latest information, guidance, materials from whatever source to inform planning and practices. So that's kind of the spirit, in my interpretation, of what guided the changes from the original watershed assessment procedures to the second edition.
All right, and if I didn't do so, Mr. Giles, maybe you can assist me, but number 14 on our list, the document on screen, if that might be marked as the next exhibit.
1113.
To round out the picture, I have two more which I can deal with quickly. Number 15, I expect will now take us to the equivalent 1995 document, but the interior document. Mr. Miller, is that correct?
I believe so. Yeah, there we are. That would be the interior one. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And finally, on this point, number 16 should be the fish stream identification guidebook from 1998.
Right, and that was of the guidebooks we've looked at here, the second of the cited guidebooks.
It was the second cited one. I'll just wait, Mr. Lunn. That's number 16 on the list of exhibits, if that might be brought up. And if I could ask that be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Do you want to do 15 first?
Yes, I do. Number 15, I neglected to have marked as an exhibit. If I could ask that be marked first.
That'd be 1114.
And
number 16 will be 1115.
Mr. Commissioner, I had set out my own time allocation of 1 hour. I'm close to it. I've had 2 donations. I haven't had that happen yet, but I appreciate that assistance from other council in the room. So I'm going a bit long, but I'm doing so mindful that I expect we're still in a position to run on schedule today. Mr. Miller, I'd like to take you to really a critique, and you've heard this critique. I'm sure you've heard it phrased better than I'll try and do now. But one of the critiques under the FERPA results-based approach focuses on this professional reliance model. In brief, some people express the concern that that sort of approach gives the keys to the wrong people, so to speak, that it hands to industry the responsibility for ensuring that things are being done properly, and perhaps puts consultants or foresters or people in a position where the model only works if there's the utmost ethical integrity, in the sense that their retainer or account may be paid by someone who has an interest in being profitable and presumably taking as many trees or as much wood as is feasible to do. So one of the concerns raised with respect to the professional reliance approach is that that's a flawed model. It should be government doing that work as opposed to relying on professionals. I'd like to ask, I know you're knowledgeable on this professional reliance model. I would like to put that critique to you and ask for your comments or response.
All right. Thank you. First of all, the professional reliance model is nothing new in British Columbia, and it's certainly nothing new in the context of forestry and forest management. Resource professionals, and I'll use the term resource professionals generally, and in the context of forestry and forest management, use that term to refer to registered professional foresters and forest technicians who are all part of the Association of BC Forest Professionals, professional engineers and geoscientists who are members of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of British Columbia, professional biologists and professional agrologists who are members of the respective professions governing those two bodies. And we, I'll, for the sake of my discussion, lump them. Those entities, those professions, those individuals have been in place and practicing in British Columbia for decades, certainly in the context of forestry and registered professional foresters since 1947. So professional reliance, generally speaking, is the reliance on professionals for advice and input to management decisions, policy decisions, because of the nature of the qualifications of those individuals, the requirements for becoming registered, the requirements for remaining registered, the requirements of our codes of ethics, which are legally binding, and the profession of forestry is governed by a statute in British Columbia. The code of ethics carries the weight of law and requires that we practice in areas that we are competent to, that there are discipline and ethics, discipline procedures if we run afoul of our limitations around professional practice. So all of that, like I say, has been in place for quite a while. Under the Forest Practices Code and with the mechanisms like cited guidebooks, with the very detailed set of act and regulations and guidebooks and decision-making procedures and all of the linkages that those created, I think it's fair to say under the Forest Practices Code, which compared to FERPA could be seen as a prescriptive model as opposed to a results-based model, and recognize that is very much a continuum. And at one side of the continuum would be the code and prescriptive, and another side would be FERPA, a more results-based approach. But where they are on the continuum is moot. But suffice it to say that significant difference does exist. Under the Forest Practices Code, very detailed, very prescriptive. The guidebooks, other than cited guidebooks, were, to guide the mechanics of putting a plan together or doing not so much a watershed assessment, but putting together a mechanism, riparian area management, for example. What wound up happening under the 10 years we managed under the Forest Practices Code is often those guidebooks became the shortest way to get approval, and time is money, as it most often is in business. We often defaulted to accepting what was in the guidebook as a way, to move through to the approval process. Guidebooks, having been written by large teams of experts, generally seen to be acceptable practice. The problems we were having is because of the linkages of the many operational plans under the code and the requirement for all of those to be consistent, it really tied us in knots and forced a lot of detail, a lot of transactions back and forth, a lot of plan amendments all over the place. So we essentially, by way of that mechanism, created an environment within which professionals were somewhat hampered in their ability to put their best advice forward. It became, or if they did put their best advice forward, tenure holders may have been, well, we need to get an approval, we need to go harvest, we need to keep wood flowing to our mills. Let's default to the guidebook practices, which everybody recognizes are appropriate for British Columbia, and move forward on that basis. Moving into the FERPA world and thinking about professional reliance in a more results-based context, it's about guidebooks being seen as guidance to professionals, but not the only piece of guidance that professionals are expected to be using. In other words, It's but one of many, and bring your best information forward. So in that regard, it's, to say, the professional statutes and all of the practices have been there for forever. The Forest Practices Code wound up convoluting that to some degree, and we've tried to create the mechanism under FERPA so that we rely on professionals to the extent that the legislation has provided society rely on them since 1947.
Mr. Delaney, I'll move next to number 19 on the list of exhibits or documents. And the context for this is, first of all, this is a letter we see on the very last page. The date of the letter is June 30, 2005. Mr. Delaney, this is a signed version. It's from the chief of the BC Interior area of OHEB, Jason Wong, and you're one of the number of people CC'd. It's a faint printout, this one, but in any event, you'll see your name as being one of the people that was CC'd on the letter. In a nutshell, if I have it, but I'd ask for your comment and see if I have this right, that this letter sets out at least the BC Interior area's transition strategy for FERPA. And I understand this to be a letter that went out to license holders requesting that they provide, for instance, notification of stream crossing work, but it also sets out on page 4, Mr. Lund, please, sets out DFO standards for S4, S5, and S6 streams. Is that correct?
Yes, as far as the riparian management side of things, or the letter itself?
Well, I asked along probably a few parts to my question. Was there anything you heard there that you thought was wrong?
The only addition to that would have, I think it's laid out in the first paragraph, if I recall from this, is it, as I mentioned in some of my opening, or my comments a few minutes ago, that there were two things happening here. You had the implementation of FERPA, so our staff were trying to trying to understand it themselves, get the information out to industry. At the same time, we had the environmental process modernization coming in, so trying to link the two so that people understood within EPMP there were the risk management approach and information that the industry and provincial ministries saw that information, so trying to see how the two link together. So that was part of it. So that's the first. And then secondly, as far as the riparian standards, as highlighted a few minutes ago, that yes, trying to get that information out to the license holders.
Before I forget to do so, if I could ask this document be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 1116.
Mr. Lunn, on page 4 of that letter, about halfway down, there's a paragraph that begins "given," and it refers to the fact that since the year 2000, that the following standards that are set out there are considered acceptable for the DFO fish habitat management objectives. Now, I appreciate that this, I'm really compressing many years of back and forth between the DFO and the province, and no doubt many more letters. Other council may take you to other materials on it. But at a general level, is it fair to say that the DFO's reaction to the riparian setback standards that the province was using for DFO was considered lacking?
As the letter states, this paragraph, that specifically for the S4 to S6 streams, the concern has been one that's outstanding going back to 2000, year 2000. So it still is an issue that we raise.
If I might go to one other document on this very topic, number 18 on the list of exhibits, we mentioned 2000. This letter is February 28. 2000 is the stamp from the Director General Pacific Region, Ms. Petrochenko, to Mr. Doney, the Deputy Minister at Forests in BC. And you'll see the last paragraph of the last sentence of the first paragraph. My staff informed me that the current logging practices in this province rarely provide riparian leaf strips or setbacks that adequately protect these streams. Talking about S4, S5, and S6 streams. It then, in the third paragraph there, says that there's an attached letter that will go from regional staff of fisheries to the district managers of the Ministry of Forest outlining the interim standards. If we then flip on to the second page, you'll see that those interim standards for S4, S5, S6 streams are set out in the numbered paragraphs. Is that correct?
Yes.
If I could ask this be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 1117.
Has this, thematically, this back and forth over setbacks and also over riparian management guidelines, has that been the source of much of the back and forth between DFO and the province, Mr. Delaney?
On the fish forestry file, there are two main issues. One is the riparian standards, and the other has been the fish stream crossing. So this has been definitely one.
And
Now,
go ahead.
I was just going to add that the sentence you referred to, the last sentence in the first paragraph, staff informing that current logging practices. So a lot of it was anecdotal information, concerns being expressed by the field staff. In the I guess it would be the late 1990s, the Auditor General's review of the habitat program pointed out a number of shortcomings and concerns that we weren't adequately protecting fish habitat. So there are a number of areas our staff were saying that are problematic. And this had been a long-standing concern, as I've noted. And but there was no rigorous monitoring or data collection to inform us that how extreme this was, if it was extreme. I think the information that my colleague Peter had presented on his most recent study is moving along in that direction of finally presenting information. Is there an impact or not?
And I don't want to anticipate too quickly what Dr. Czaplinski's answer may be, but presumably that FREP look in the range of 2005 to 2008 is a detailed picture, assuming that may be the sort of answer he'd give. Is that a complete answer to the concerns that the DFO had? Is it a partial answer? Does it leave matters outstanding, Mr. Delaney?
Sorry, was that a question?
I'm sorry. Well, yes, it was. I added your name
I was
at the
looking
end.
at Peter.
No, it was prefaced on what I thought he might say.
But
I'm
sorry.
But
Right.
I'm anticipating that is one view of it. Is the FREP report an answer, or does it leave concerns outstanding?
I think it's a good direction to be going. It's very useful information. I'm unaware, I could be correct on this, of any structured review within the department of that report. Some of the recommendations coming out of it, of the 10-meter leave strip in the reserve zone is part of the message that we've been trying to get it implemented. And so if those recommendations are carried forward, one of the other areas that we've been trying to work on is a revamping of the Riparian Area Management Guidebook, and hopefully those recommendations would be included in the guidebook at that point, so that fish-bearing streams or those leading into fish-bearing streams would have a stronger protection on them.
I'd like to bring up number 10 on the list of, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting whether I've had that document marked as an exhibit. The letter from February 28, 2000. I'll move then to number 10 on the list of exhibits. Mr. Delaney, and you can tell me if this is a joint report from 2001, a joint assessment.
Yes, it is.
And I won't move into that in any detail. I'll ask that please be marked as the next exhibit.
It's exhibit 1118.
What I'll now do in the time looking to try and hold to the schedule we have, I'm going to move into some questions about the policy and practice report that the Commission has prepared that's now in evidence in these proceedings, and then I'll ask a rather general question so that if you have particular points, you're certainly welcome to add to them. I appreciate to some extent Mr. Miller and Dr. Czaplinski, you may have had comments in response to Mr. Delaney's recent remarks, so I'll give you that chance when we wrap up, if you will. Let me move then into questions that address the policy and practice report. With a view to doing this as efficiently as possible, I'll have the policy and practice report on screen. I plan to lead unless council raise any concerns with me doing that in order to do this as quickly as possible. I'll begin at page 6 of the report. And Dr. Czaplinski, I'll begin with you, sir, and move through these questions. page 6, paragraph 6. There's a description of large woody debris, and I won't read out the first few sentences, but I take it that you raised the point that not all streams or fish-bearing streams require wood for channel morphology, that some streams, and especially steeper gradient streams or non-alluvial channels, are boulder or bedrock controlled.
That is correct, sir.
Page 11 and paragraph 17. This is a small matter, but there's reference to, you'll see about 3 lines down on page 11, now warehouse or company, perhaps more accurately later warehouse, or I understand Weyerhaeuser isn't presently in operation in this province, or at least that doesn't accurately describe the company. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You'll see in that same paragraph, about a few more lines down, that there's reference to the Carnation Creek project, a very important project. Indeed, I understand you worked on, Dr. Hartman as well, was very involved in that project, that it was over 35 years. Indeed, it's over 40 years. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. It was initiated in 1970, and here we are in 2011.
Page 15, paragraph 28. The second sentence, we're talking about the transition from the FPC Act to FERPA, significantly reducing requirements on industry. Instead of 6 plans under the code, and it goes on to discuss, you make the point that watershed assessments were not mandatory for all watersheds.
That is correct, sir. They were, in general, mandatory for community watersheds. In other watersheds that were not community watersheds, the delegated decision maker, or usually the district manager, could ask for an assessment to be done if the district manager had certain concerns about the level of development in that watershed and what the implications of additional development might be.
Page 17, paragraph 37, the first sentence, the Forest Development Plan FDP was the main operational plan. You offer the comment on that to the effect that it's not accurate to say the FDP was the main operational plan. It may be a plan that covers a wide operating area. The silviculture prescription was the site level operational plan that in fact specified and laid out in detail exactly what would happen on the ground.
That is correct, sir. The Forest Development Plan was an overarching plan that covered a bigger operating area. The site plans, including the main one of those was the silviculture prescription, really had all the details of what would be carried out, where the cut blocks would be, the approximate location or more accurate location of all roads, the presence of streams all classified as per fish-bearing or non-fish-bearing status, and so forth.
Page 22, paragraph 50, there's a table that's set out at page 22 there in the middle. The first one on S1, I take it it's the correct or the more detailed point is that it's to be 100 meters wide for the minimum stream length of 1 kilometer?
That is correct, sir.
Page 23, paragraph 53, second sentence. The class of a wetland or lake is based on the size in hectares and the presence of different species of trees. You make the point that wetland and lake classes are not really determined by the tree species so much as the geoclimatic ecological zone, or BEC zone.
That is correct, sir. It depends on what we call the BEC zones in short, and it's essentially the aquatic community as influenced by the moisture regimes in each of these forested zones.
Page 26, moving towards the typo, but an important typo correction, I suppose. Paragraph 60, second line, Ministry of Water, Land and Air Pollution should be protection.
It would be preferred if that was the designation, yes, sir.
Well, it is a typo, but I did think we should get to it. Page 33, paragraph 78, you make the point, just to clarify what's said out there, that the class S1-A under the FERPA is in fact the same as the class S1 large under...
That is correct. That's the
Thank you.
updated
Under
classification.
Thank you. And my last point for you, sir, page 53 of this report, paragraph 121. This makes reference to the Joint Steering Committee and the Joint Management Committee. I think indeed we touched on this earlier today, but those indeed date back to the implementation of the Forest Practices Code in the mid-90s, 1995 in particular.
That's correct, sir.
Thank you. And they're continued then under FERPA.
Indeed.
All right. I'll be quicker with the next two witnesses on these PPR points. I appreciate it may be a little tedious, but it's important that we address it on the record this way. Page 9, Mr. Miller, I'll direct questions to you next. I have just a few. Page 9, paragraph 13, the last sentence, indeed adding a clarification to that.
Right. The second last sentence in this paragraph reads, the ministry is the government's agency responsible for the management of forest harvesting and the forest industry. And then this last sentence goes on to say, the ministry exercises this authority mainly through the Provincial Forest and Range Practices Act. That is one of the two primary statutes we use. Well, actually one of three. The second would be the Forest Act, which deals with mostly tenuring issues. Whereas the Forest and Range Practices Act is somewhat self-explanatory, deals with forest and range practices, and the Wildfire Act itself, which deals with all aspects of fire management in the province. So, in the context, though, of management of harvesting and the forest industry, I think the two acts, FERPA as referenced and the Forest Act, would be probably the most germane.
I'll jump to page 30, paragraph 68. The last sentence there reads, in an FSP or WLP, a licensee must describe its strategies to achieve the objectives set out in the FERPA and its regulations. I take it you would offer a suggestion to that the licensee must describe at least one result or strategy for each of the objectives set out in the FERPA and its regulations, and indeed would suggest a further sentence to the effect that each result or strategy must be consistent with the objective for which it was written.
Correct. With one small caveat, there are other sources of objectives set by government other than just the Act and its regulations. The FERPA, the Act, has another regulation called the Government Actions Regulation, which sets out authorities for statutory decision makers to craft objectives for things like wildlife habitat areas, ungilt winter ranges, scenic areas. There's a host. Those objectives, when put in place, also obligate tenure holders. So they are not set out in the regulation, but they are created as a creature of regulation.
I'm going to move next, Mr. Delaney, to just a few questions. Page 10 rather, paragraph 15. There's reference in the second last sentence that the federal government DFO is responsible for ensuring that forestry activities are carried out in a manner that does not harm fish or fish habitat. You would offer the observation that the Fisheries Act is results-based, it's reactive to harm to fish and fish habitat, and that that could be misleading.
Yes.
Paragraph 108. The habitat protection provisions do not create a mandatory obligation for licensees to seek advice or authorization from DFO. However, failure to do so may expose a licensee to charges and prosecutions under the Act. The comment with respect to that is that could again leave the wrong impression. The lack of participation on the referral process doesn't necessarily expose a licensee to charges or prosecution. Instead, it would be the non-compliance with habitat protection provisions.
That's correct.
Paragraph 141. Page 64. The technical working group has developed a strategic approach, it says at the top of that page, outlining the approach to address the fish passage issue, estimates $4 million a year in order to implement key elements of a strategic plan. I take it to put that in a context, your comment would be that it would require hundreds of millions of dollars to fully rectify the fish passage issue in the province based on what's gone on, for instance, in Washington State.
Yes.
And on the first bullet there, prioritization, you'll see reference to that. And I take it that the DFO has previously indicated concerns with the provincial prioritization protocol, that in fact the concern being that the prioritization tool underestimates fisheries values for some or for specific watersheds where stock assessment data is limited.
Yes, that's the comment that has been supplied.
Paragraph 158, page 72. There's reference to Baker Creek, a study that was done there in 2007, a tributary of the Fraser at Quesnel containing high-value salmon habitat. The clarification there is that's not sockeye spawning or rearing habitat, rather Chinook and rainbow.
Yes.
And that because of its pine-dominant forest and watershed characteristics, Baker Creek has been considered a worst-case scenario for pine beetle impacts on hydrology.
Yes.
I think you'll be happy to hear that my last question goes just a few pages on to paragraph 164, page 74. And really the comment is, to summarize it quickly, is read what Erlen McIsaac says in his email, but that it may be overstated in the introduction, which says the comment to the effect that he is saying Fraser River sockeye natal watersheds are not threatened by mountain pine beetle. You simply caution that that may overstate what indeed he says there.
Yes, that's true.
The point being that in some Fraser River sockeye natal watersheds, in particular the Nechako River drainage, there are significant amounts of pine in the catchments.
Yes.
Thank you. Rather than using more time for a general question, Mr. Commissioner, I'm minded to simply move on to participants' questions. Counsel for these witnesses, of course, may look to take them to particular points. If I might just take a moment to check with Mr. Prowse if you wish to break. Mr. Prowse for the province next. Thank you.
So, Mr. Commissioner, Cliff Prowse on behalf of the province of British Columbia. It's always amazing how fast things seem to go, at least from council's point of view on some of these days. I think I'll take the time, sorry, and I believe I have 30 minutes. I think I'll start with the question that my friend Mr. Marlin didn't have time to ask, which is, first of all, Mr. Miller, do you have any comments to any of the concerns that have been expressed to you in the last few minutes that you want to make?
No, thank you.
And Dr. Szoplinski?
Just a couple of comments, sir, if I could. I'd like to comment specifically on FREP report number 27 and just enter the comment that that report is an internationally peer-reviewed publication, blind peer-reviewed at one level, and internationally in the Pacific Northwest, leading riparian stream scientists from both the federal government and from the forest industry did contribute to peer reviewing that. Peer reviews were received from the U.S. National Riparian Team, which essentially represent the gold standard of monitoring in the United States, as well as the United States Forest Service, Oregon State University, senior scientists from Weyerhaeuser Company and the Pacific Redwood Company in California. I just wanted to illustrate that this report is not simply a routine ministry unpeer-reviewed document. It is founded in science. It was developed cooperatively, federally, provincially, and by academia, and passed a rigorous peer review by 8 researchers.
Thank you. Any other points you want to
I would like to comment on the Baker Creek matter touched on a moment ago by council and Mr. Delaney. My hydrology colleagues in the provincial government do have some concerns with this, with the Baker Creek study that was done by Dr. Eunice Alila of the University of British Columbia. The study which identified potential hydrologic impacts at Baker Creek were, that study was based on modeling, and according to some of my colleagues, they are concerned with some of the assumptions in that model. The Baker Creek watershed contains enormous coverage by wetlands. Wetlands are a very important hydrological sink and source of water, and that component was not included as part of the model's parameterization. So the model, in fact, can overestimate the hydrologic effects, not accounting for the buffering effects of wetlands and groundwater. I just wanted to enter that as a comment.
Mr. Miller, if you could look at the book, which I hope you have, of the BC provincial documents. I want to get you or ask you to make some comments on professional reliance and what you have done about that. So, first of all, I believe that tab 5 is a discussion document, Mr. Lund?
That's correct, a discussion document produced by the Association of BC Forest Professionals last year.
And can you tell the Commissioner what your involvement has been over the years with that association?
With the association on the matter of professional reliance specifically, I was a participant, representative of the provincial government on the Professional Reliance Task Force. That was a group of the 4 professional associations I referenced earlier, the provincial government, and representatives from the forest industry associations of the day, and I believe COFI, Council of Forest Industries, and Coast Forest Products Association. Their names have changed and their memberships have changed, but it's those, that level of organization. So I participated in that group. That was the development of, led to the development of what remains the working definition of professional reliance in the province of British Columbia. I'm also engaged as within the ministry, advisor for staff on matters relative to professional accountability. I've also worked as a volunteer to the association in preparing portions of the annually produced document that is a kind of legislation and policy compendium produced primarily for students studying for their policy exam, one of the last steps in becoming a registered professional forester, but also used as a reference material by practicing professionals across the province.
And your purpose in working with this group, both as a volunteer and in your employed capacity, what are you trying to do when you do that?
Provide the best guidance and the most current guidance that we can to resource professionals about how to carry out their activities, understanding the notion and concept of professional reliance and the obligations and responsibilities that brings.
Thank you. Mr. Len, might that be marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 1119.
Mr. Len, if you could turn to tab 7 of the provincial documents. So this is notes of a presentation that you made this year to Cisco, and can you explain who Cisco is and
right.
So who the attendees were?
Sure. Cisco is an acronym for the Southern Interior Silviculture Committee. It's a long-standing group, essentially ad hoc. It's not a government committee, it's not an industry committee, it's not a professional association committee. It's a group of practicing professionals, most of whom work in the field of silviculture and the associated fields, largely, as I understand it, brought together to provide a forum for collaboration, discussion, and they do have, I think, in the case of Cisco, at least a couple of annual workshops where they bring practicing professionals together to, discuss matters of collective interest. So the Cisco meeting, the winter workshop in April in Naramata, consisted of, I think, 2 full days of presentations from, on various topics from various professionals and other practitioners. I was there to speak as one of, I think, 7 speakers on professional reliance in the first day morning panel. And this slide deck you have in front of you is the gist of my presentation to Cisco at that time.
Yes, and Mr. Lunn, if on the 5th page, There's a, if you could turn to that, it's actually the one that says sources, although it's hard to resist reading the first line on the one you did show. But the next page after that, sources, yes. So one of the sources you refer there is our reader's discussion paper on expectations.
Yeah.
Who is Roberta Reeder, first of all?
Roberta Reeder is now a retired civil servant. She has carried a number of portfolios relative to forestry and forest management, the code, and FERPA in particular. And I'll try and go through them. I'll try and be complete and chronological.
I think you should try to be quick.
Try to be quick. Roberta was formerly Director of Compliance and Enforcement in our ministry. She has been legislative counsel. She's worked as a practicing lawyer for the province of British Columbia as a legislative drafter and legislative counsel. She worked with us in doing some of the legislative drafting for the FERPA. She produced some preliminary kind of internal discussion papers around results-based and what legal principles for results-based. She most latterly, having retired from the provincial government, came back to us on contract and wrote the discussion paper that's referred to here. And I know it's one of the documents in play here. The full title is...
Yes, Mr. Lunn, if you could turn to tab 12 of the province's document.
This is, a 300 some odd page discussion paper, the expectations that affect the management of public forest and rangelands in British Columbia, looking outside the legislation. And the whole purpose and point of the paper is to explain clearly that legislation and natural resource related legislation, for example, FERPA, is but one small piece and perhaps the topmost of the visible part of an iceberg, much of which lies below the perhaps immediately recognized surface.
And
so that's the pieces outside the legislation.
And what's the importance of expectations and things outside of the legislation?
Well, I think the best example I can use is we all recognize there's laws in the province and we have to follow the laws. There are a number of other societal expectations, some of which informed by science, some of which not, that are important in our society and are important in resource management. The best example, and the one that perhaps everybody in the room here can relate to, is raising children. There are statutes in British Columbia that relate to raising children. How many have read them? I suspect very few. How many people in the room are parents? How many people think they're doing a good job as a parent? Why do you think you're doing a good job? It's because you're very well tuned into societal expectations around that. Natural resource management has a number of analogies. There are statutes in British Columbia that govern the work we do. FERPA notable among them. The Foresters Act would be another example. There are issues around liability and negligence that are based in case law. They're important for resource practitioners to consider. There's a large body of science thanks to people like my two colleagues on the panel today. And there's a whole host of social expectations that drive the work we do as individuals, as resource practitioners, as companies, as government. And they all have a role to play. And Roberta spent 300 pages discussing those various expectations and how they might play out.
All right, and just for the record, so I've included in the extract the executive summary, the table of contents, and the part of the chapter on professional reliance from that 300 pages. So, Mr. Lunn, if I think we haven't marked the presentation, so the next two exhibits, if they can be the presentation and the extract.
The presentation at tab 7 will be marked as 1,120. And your document at tab 12 will be marked as 1,121.
And if I may, just to round out the rest of the answer to the question why I was at Cisco, recognizing that is certainly within our ministry, I'm one of the few remaining staff, many of the others of whom have now since retired or moved on in one way, shape, or form, that was participated through most of, if not all, the policy discussions that led up to FERPA and much of the legislative drafting around FERPA, to help the audience understand kind of what was the thinking in the background, what were we trying to do, what were we trying to create, help the reader and those that have to implement FERPA kind of understand a bit of the backstory. So I was asked to deliver that presentation and recognize that while a discussion of intent and what were we trying to accomplish is perhaps interesting, it doesn't necessarily help people interpret the law for themselves and have to, in terms of carrying it out. So I was there as a professional forester representing my own views.
If you can pass the binder of provincial documents in the index over to Dr. Czaplinski. I want to mark with you, if you can, yes, at tab 2, Mr. Lund, the provincial documents. What does this document tell us, Dr. Czaplinski?
The document under tab 2 is a streamlined watershed management issue, and it summarizes the outcomes from a symposium and workshop held at the University of British Columbia in February 2007. That symposium was all about small stream science and management, and all about the latest science and what about that latest science that might be used to inform better management of small streams.
And Erland McIsaac, who's referred to on the first page, is a DFO scientist that you worked with, I think, closely through the years?
That is correct, sir. I've worked with Erland and his colleagues extensively for nearly 20 years.
All right, Mr. Lund, might that be the next exhibit?
Exhibit 1120.
And then I think that...
I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong number. That should be 1122.
So, looking at the index, Dr. Czaplinski, the next documents, tabs 8, 9, 10, and 11, can you tell us in a sentence or two what they're about?
The 3 documents that you refer to, Mr. Prowse, are research-related initiatives linked to the mountain pine beetle epidemic and the salvage harvest program. The first document, tab 8, was a research project that I helped put together. It was about what the long-term effects were of a similar kind of infestation that occurred back in the late 1970s and 1980s. It was the spruce bark beetle infestation, and a lot of salvage harvest activity occurred in the 1980s in response to that. And this activity was widespread in the Bowron, large clear cuts, some riparian areas cut completely, and more than 20 years later, we were interested in the long-term impacts to that salvage harvest program. And so the short story is that, yes, we did find impacts where riparian harvesting was complete, fewer impacts and more levels of recovery where riparian areas were largely left alone.
All right.
The next item under tab 9, it's about mountain pine beetle and salvage harvesting impacts for small streams. In this case, primarily small fish-bearing streams. And the outcome of this is that when riparian areas are left that are 10 meters wide or wider, the stream functions remain intact. For riparian buffers that are smaller, such as 5 meters wide or less, there are more measurable impacts. So properly functioning condition is the typical outcome for the streams buffered 10 meters or better, and there are more impacts associated with lesser levels of retention. The report does recommend that a 10-meter buffer be applied at minimum to these small streams, consistent with the findings in the FREP report and some other reports that have been generated lately. The final document is about channel structural changes that may occur as a consequence of the mountain pine beetle infestation. This report was by Dr. Marwan Hassan of the University of British Columbia, Dan Hogan, who was part of my watershed research program until that program was, and the research branch of the Ministry of Forests was dissolved recently. Dan is now with the Ministry of Environment. Steve Bird is a senior consultant, as channel river scientist, fluvial geomorphologist, as they say. This report looked at the consequences of beetle-killed trees in riparian areas, the consequences for channel impacts, and the conclusion was that in most riparian areas, even when all the pine dies, pine's not a leading species in these areas, so that the amount of impact on the channel is limited by that factor. That even if all the pine died and fell into the channel, the additional volume of debris that might result in log jams and channel-related impacts was within the natural range of variability that has been historically seen in this kind of in this region and in these streams over a relatively long period of time. And the base of that information for comparison was part of Dan Hogan's nearly 20 years of work in all of the major forested BEC zones of the province. So.
All right, so if those three documents might be marked as the next three exhibits.
Number 8 will be 1,123, 1,124. Number 10 will be 1,125.
I'm not sure, is it Mr. Miller or Dr. Czaplinski? Mr. Lund, if you could just show tab 11. And is this, Mr. Miller, something you should comment on or can?
I'll speak to it first, and if Pete needs to wade in, I'm sure he will.
All right. So what is this, and what's the bottom line as to
Okay,
what
this is, and we spoke earlier of the role of guidance and how guidance, helps resource professionals do their job. This is a piece of guidance, thank you, produced by the Forest Service, or by the Ministry of Forests and Lands, I guess, at the time. Actually, it might have just been the Ministry of Forests in 2005. Lost a bit of track of our various name changes over the years. But I say this is part of our, looking in 2005 at the early days of the mountain pine beetle infestation, considering the increase in salvage logging programs, the increase in directed harvest into mountain pine beetle infected stands by existing tenure holders, and looking at the impact of perhaps concentrating harvest on that land base and producing some guidance for structural retention. That's the large tracts of forest land essentially undisturbed with the structural characteristics, even though the trees themselves may be dead, they do carry a number of wildlife habitat and hydrologic function capabilities in the forest. So it's about as we harvest more on a finite land base, those harvested areas tend to run together. You have the potential to create extensive clear-cut or harvested areas, and the guidance is there for professionals to both acknowledge that possibility and to plan for specific retention levels and increasing levels of retention as functional openings, large aggregated openings are created to create over and above the levels of retention that would normally have been left, to add increasing levels in recognition that we are creating increasingly large openings on the land base.
So, sorry, I think you may have just told me that there's ongoing work to update this document.
And yes, there is. This is a 2005 document. We've since been tracking, monitoring not only salvage harvest, but other harvest operations and the extent and location of the mountain pine beetle infestation itself. I think sufficient to say, and not only has the provincial government doing this, but the Forest Practices Board, among others, released a study around this. We've been following up, and one of the follow-up actions to come from this is an updating of this particular piece of guidance. And the one thing in particular, when you look near the bottom of this particular piece of guidance, and my apologies, Mr. Lunn, I'm not sure if that's on exactly which page. Let me find it for you. That would be the second to last page, so page 6, please. There's a table 1 at the bottom of that. The table contemplates opening sizes above 1,000 hectares, but we're now seeing aggregated openings of at least one order of magnitude larger than that. We're seeing aggregated openings in the tens of thousands of hectares range, and one of the particular pieces of update to this guidance will be to produce, replicate this table, but for increasingly large openings.
Thank you. And Dr. Chaplinsky, reference has been made this morning to Carnation Creek, and the Commission, in the context of the wild salmon policy, has heard reference to Barkley Sound and has heard evidence from Dr. Kim Hyatt. Dr. Kim Hyatt is a DFO colleague that you collaborated with over the years?
That is correct, sir. I've collaborated with Dr. Hyatt extensively since 1987, 1988 in various projects.
So I've heard it said that you are a person of heroic vision and courage in keeping Carnation Creek going for some large chunk of this 40 years. Can you explain to the Commissioner why Carnation Creek may be of importance to the wild salmon policy going forward? Very briefly, I'm afraid.
Well, those are indeed some very kind words. They may reflect to the difficulty in keeping long-term, multi-agency, watershed-scale basic research projects going. They're expensive, but the information they generate is essential for so many things. Things that come up like mountain pine beetle, often researchers and managers will say, gosh, I wish we had a base of information upon which to compare where we might go to where we've been. Studies like Carnation Creek reveal a lot about how watersheds work. Carnation Creek is located in Barkley Sound. It is become an important addendum or adjunct to the wild salmon policy. I'm in discussions at this moment with Fisheries and Oceans Canada Stock Assessment, South Coast area, and with Kim Hyatt from Science Branch on how to support the wild salmon policy from information generated by Carnation Creek. Carnation Creek data was instrumental in part of the scientific foundation of the FREP indicators and methods, and those indicators and methods are being welcomed by my DFO colleagues as a possible contribution to part of their wild salmon policy that requires habitat assessments to determine the state of the habitat and identify where, for example, remediation might be applied.
Mr. Commissioner, I've almost finished my questions within the limited time. I'm wondering if it might be possible to take the break now, and then I can conclude after the break.
Absolutely, Mr. President.
Mr. Commissioner, because we're running a longer session, we had suggested a 20-minute break. I'm in your hands whether we do 15 or 20 minutes.
I'm content with 15 if that will help.
It may well, indeed. I think we'll take every minute we can, so maybe the 15-minute break. Thank you.
Prior to breaking, did Mr. Prost wish to mark tab 11?
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Please.
Yes, that'll be 1,126. Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.